Sometimes the best things in life happen when you least expect them. Sometimes they crash right into you on a dusty Tuesday morning when your heart has forgotten how to smile. Marshal Clay McKenna was walking down Main Street in Willowbrook when Miss Birdie Calloway came running around the corner like her life depended on it. She slammed straight into his chest, sending his hat flying and nearly knocking them both to the ground. Her dress was torn, her hair was wild, and she was talking fast about a pig and a missing pie. Clay was known for keeping his cool, but this woman left him speechless. She wasn't running from trouble, she was bringing it with her, the good kind that makes a lonely man remember what happiness feels like. But what was Birdie really running from that day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clay McKenna stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch house, watching the sun paint the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose. The house was too big for one man, 12 rooms that echoed with memories he'd rather forget and dreams that had died long ago. His father had built this place to last generations, but Clay was the end of the line, and he knew it. The silver marshal's badge pinned to his vest caught the morning light, a constant reminder of the choice he'd made 5 years ago. Most folks couldn't understand why a man with more money than half the territory would want to pin on a badge and deal with drunks, claim jumpers, and the occasional gunfighter looking to make a name for himself. The truth was simpler than they imagined and more complicated than he cared to explain. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, emerged from the kitchen with a steaming cup of coffee, and that look she got when she was about to lecture him about something. She'd been with the family since before Clay was born, brought over from San Francisco by his father during the railroad boom. Now she was the only person who dared to speak her mind to him without worrying about consequences. "You're brooding again," she said, setting the cup on the porch rail beside him. "Standing out here like a scarecrow won't change whatever's eating at you." Clay picked up the coffee and inhaled the rich aroma. "Just thinking about the day ahead. Mrs. Chen. Town council meeting at 10, then I need to check on the Henderson place. Someone's been stealing chickens." She crossed her arms over her ample chest. "That why you've been pacing the floors at night? Because of stolen chickens?" He'd forgotten how little escaped her notice. "Sleep's been hard to come by lately." "Sleep comes easier to a man with purpose. All this money your father left you, all this land, what good does it do if you're just going through the motions?" Clay's fingers absently traced the leather cover of his father's ranch ledger, tucked under his arm as always. The worn book contained 30 years of careful records, cattle counts, weather patterns, profit margins, and the steady accumulation of wealth that had made the McKenna name synonymous with success throughout the territory. His father, Jeremiah McKenna, had been a force of nature, building an empire from nothing but determination and an iron will. "Papa had his dreams," Clay said quietly. "I'm just trying to honor them." "Your father wanted you to be happy, not haunted." Mrs. Chen's voice softened. "He'd be proud of the man you've become, but he'd want you to live, not just exist." Clay opened the ledger, running his thumb over pages filled with his father's precise handwriting. The numbers told the story of a man who'd come west with empty pockets and built something lasting. Cattle herds that stretched across thousands of acres, investments in mining operations, partnerships with the railroad, all of it carefully documented in Jeremiah's steady hand. The weight of that legacy pressed down on Clay's shoulders like a physical thing. Every decision his father had made was calculated, purposeful, designed to benefit future generations. But there wouldn't be any future generations, not unless Clay could find a way to open his heart again. "Deputy Walsh should be here soon," Clay said, closing the ledger and finishing his coffee. "We've got patrol rounds to plan." Mrs. Chen shook her head but didn't press further. She'd learned when to push and when to let things be. "I'll have lunch ready when you get back." "And, Clay, try to remember that badge isn't a suit of armor. It's just a piece of metal." 20 minutes later, Deputy Tom Walsh rode up the long drive on his bay gelding, dust trailing behind him like a comet's tail. Tom was a good man, honest and reliable, though he sometimes lacked the confidence to make hard decisions without Clay's input. He'd been deputy for 3 years now, learning the job from a marshal who kept most folks at arm's length. "Morning, Marshal," Tom called, dismounting near the hitching post. "Beautiful day for it." "It is." Clay secured the ledger in his saddlebag and swung onto his black stallion, Thunder. The horse was another inheritance from his father, bred for endurance and intelligence rather than show. "Any word from town?" Mrs. Henderson came by the office early, madder than a wet cat. "Says someone got into her chicken coop again last night. Took 3 of her best laying hens." Clay frowned. Chicken theft was usually the work of desperate folks or youngsters looking for trouble, but 3 times in 2 weeks suggested something more organized. "Any tracks?" "Boot prints around the coop, but the ground's too hard to tell much." "Could be anyone." They rode toward town at an easy pace, the morning air carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. This was Clay's favorite time of day, when the world felt fresh and full of possibilities, before the weight of responsibility settled back onto his shoulders. Willowbrook was a modest town, the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business and strangers were noticed within an hour of arrival. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass comfortably, lined with wooden buildings that had weathered their share of seasons. Henderson's general store anchored one end, while the Silver Dollar Saloon held down the other. In between were the necessities of frontier life, the blacksmith, the doc's office, the hotel, and the small white church that served as the town's moral compass. Clay had been born here, raised here, and buried his dreams here. Every street held memories, some sweet, others painful enough to make him wish he could ride away and never look back. But duty held him fast. Duty, and the knowledge that someone had to stand between order and chaos in this little corner of the world. "Marshal McKenna," Mrs. Henderson called from the steps of her store, waving her apron like a flag of distress. "I need to speak with you about those thieving varmints." Clay dismounted and tipped his hat to the grey-haired woman who'd been dispensing candy to local children and stern advice to their parents for as long as he could remember. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson. Tom told me about your trouble. 3 more hens, Marshal. Good layers, too. This can't go on. A woman's got to protect her livelihood. Any idea who might be taking them? Someone down on their luck, maybe?" Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "Well, there's the widow Parker with those 3 little ones, and old Jake who lives in that shack by the creek, but Jake's got his pride, wouldn't take what wasn't offered. As for Sarah Parker, I've been meaning to bring her some eggs anyway." Clay nodded. This was the side of frontier justice that didn't make it into dime novels, the careful balance between law and compassion, between protecting property and understanding human need. "I'll ask around, see if anyone's noticed anything unusual. In the meantime, maybe we could set up a watch on your coop." "I'd appreciate that, Marshal. These old bones need their sleep." As Mrs. Henderson headed back into her store, Clay caught sight of movement near the church. A young woman in a blue dress was struggling with something, her movements animated and clearly frustrated. Even at a distance, there was something about her energy that seemed out of place in the quiet morning routine of Willowbrook. "Tom, why don't you start with the Henderson place? Check for more tracks, maybe ask around about who might have been near the general store last night." "What about you, Marshal?" Clay's gaze drifted back toward the church. "I'll check on things at the other end of town. Meet back at the office in an hour." Tom nodded and headed toward the back of the store, while Clay found his feet carrying him down Main Street toward whatever commotion was developing near the church. He told himself it was just routine patrol, the kind of thorough attention to detail that kept small problems from becoming big ones. But as he walked, Clay McKenna had no idea that his carefully ordered world was about to collide with a force of nature in a blue calico dress and that his lonely heart was about to remember what it felt like to be truly alive. The silver badge on his chest caught the morning sun, reflecting light like a beacon. Soon, very soon, that badge would become more than just a symbol of duty. It would become a reminder of the moment when everything changed, when a collision on a dusty street showed a millionaire marshal that some things in life were worth more than all the money in the world. His father's ledger rested secure in his saddlebag, filled with the careful records of a life well lived but narrowly focused. Clay didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover that the most important entries in life's ledger couldn't be measured in dollars or cattle or acres of land. They could only be measured in moments of connection, in laughter that chased away years of silence, and in the courage to believe that it was never too late for a fresh start. Birdie Calloway pressed her fingers to her mother's cameo brooch, seeking comfort from the only precious thing she owned. The delicate ivory carving of a woman's profile had belonged to 3 generations of Calloway women, and now it was all she had left of the life she'd known back in Philadelphia. The brooch had survived her mother's death, her father's gambling debts, and the humiliation that had driven her west to this dusty frontier town where nobody knew her shame. "Birdie," Uncle Ezekiel's voice boomed from the parsonage kitchen, "where did you put those hymnals I asked you to organize?" "They're on the table by the window, Uncle," she called back, though she suspected he wouldn't find them there. Her uncle was a good man with a kind heart, but he had very specific ideas about how young ladies should behave, and Birdie had been disappointing him regularly since her arrival 3 weeks ago. The truth was, she'd never been good at being the kind of quiet, obedient woman that frontier towns seemed to expect. Back east, her spirited nature had been tolerated as charming eccentricity, at least until it had gotten her into the kind of trouble that made staying impossible. She closed her eyes and let herself remember, just for a moment, the comfortable life she'd left behind. Her father's law practice, the big house on Chestnut Street, the round of social calls and charity work that had filled her days. All of it built on borrowed money and false promises, crumbling like a house of cards when the truth came out. "Birdie, come here, child." She hurried into the kitchen where Uncle Ezekiel was frowning at a piece of paper covered in his careful handwriting. He was a tall man, spare as a fence post, with kind blue eyes that reminded her painfully of her mother. "I'm working on Sunday's sermon," he said, "and I can't seem to find the right words for this passage about redemption. Your mother always said you had a gift for seeing the heart of things." Birdie felt a flutter of warmth. Uncle Ezekiel rarely asked for her opinion on matters of theology, though she'd been reading scripture and philosophy since she was old enough to hold a book. "What passage are you wrestling with?" "The story of the woman at the well, about second chances and grace for those who've made mistakes." He glanced up at her with gentle understanding. "I thought you might have some insight." The irony wasn't lost on her. She was living that story now, seeking redemption in a place far from home, hoping to prove that past mistakes didn't have to define a person's future. "Maybe it's about how grace finds us when we least expect it," she said softly, "when we're just trying to live our lives and do better than before." Uncle Ezekiel nodded thoughtfully. "That's good. That's very good." He paused. "Speaking of doing better, I should mention that Mrs. Hutchins saw you yesterday, helping the Murphy children catch fireflies behind the schoolhouse." Birdie's heart sank. "Is that a problem?" "Not for me, child, but Mrs. Hutchins has opinions about proper behavior for young ladies. She thinks you should be more focused on finding a suitable husband and settling down." "I'm not ready for that, Uncle. Not yet." The words came out more firmly than she'd intended. "I need time to figure out who I am without—" She stopped herself before she could mention Theodore and the mess she'd left behind. Uncle Ezekiel reached over and patted her hand. A sudden commotion from outside interrupted their conversation. Shouting, the sound of running feet, and what distinctly sounded like oinking. Birdie's stomach dropped as she recognized the particular quality of panic in the voices. "Oh, no," she whispered, rushing to the window. "Oh, no, no, no." There, rooting happily through Mrs. Henderson's carefully arranged pie display. Outside the general store was Jeremiah, the church's prize pig, named after the late Jeremiah McKenna in a moment of questionable pastoral judgment. The enormous Yorkshire boar was systematically destroying what looked like a week's worth of baking, while a growing crowd of townspeople gathered to watch the spectacle. "How did he get loose?" Uncle Ezekiel asked, joining her at the window. "I was cleaning his pen this morning," Birdie admitted miserably. "I thought I latched the gate properly, but he must have figured out how to work it open. He's too smart for his own good." The pig had now discovered Mrs. Henderson's prized apple pies and was expressing his appreciation with enthusiastic grunts and flying pastry crumbs. Mrs. Henderson herself appeared in the doorway of her store, took one look at the destruction, and let out a wail that probably reached the next county. "I have to do something," Birdie said, already moving toward the door. "Birdie, wait." But she was already running, her skirts gathered in her hands, the cameo brooch bouncing against her chest with each hurried step. The sight that greeted her in the street was worse than she'd feared. Jeremiah had not only destroyed the pie display, but had somehow managed to tangle himself in the bunting that had been strung up for the upcoming harvest festival. Red, white, and blue fabric trailed behind him like a patriotic tail as he trotted down Main Street, still carrying a considerable portion of apple pie in his mouth. "Here, pig. Come here, you stubborn," Birdie called, knowing it was hopeless. Jeremiah only responded to food bribes and gentle persuasion, neither of which seemed practical under current circumstances. The crowd was growing larger and more amused by the minute. She could hear comments ranging from "that's the preacher's niece" to "someone ought to do something" to "best entertainment we've had all month." Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but there was nothing to do but keep chasing the runaway pig and hope for divine intervention. That's when she saw Marshal McKenna walking down the street toward the commotion, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. This was exactly the kind of attention she'd been hoping to avoid. The last thing she needed was to establish herself as the town troublemaker in the eyes of the law. Jeremiah, perhaps sensing that his freedom was about to be curtailed, picked up speed. He charged straight down the middle of Main Street with Birdie in hot pursuit, her hair coming loose from its pins and her dress threatening to tear on the wooden sidewalk planks. She was so focused on the pig that she didn't see the marshal step directly into her path. She hit him with enough force to knock the wind from both of their lungs, sending his hat flying and nearly bringing them both to the ground. For a moment they stood there, her hands pressed against his chest, his steady grip on her arms, the only thing keeping her upright. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised her. "Seems like you're having some trouble." "The pig," she gasped, trying to catch her breath and her composure at the same time. "Jeremiah got loose, and he's destroyed Mrs. Henderson's pies. And now he's tangled in the festival bunting, and I don't know how to catch him, and Uncle Ezekiel is going to be so disappointed, and—" "Easy," Marshal McKenna said, his hands still steadying her. "One problem at a time." Birdie looked up into his face and felt something shift in her chest. His eyes were grey like storm clouds, but there was kindness there, and something else, a loneliness that she recognized because it lived in her own heart. "I'm Birdie Calloway," she said, suddenly aware that half the town was watching their encounter. The preacher's niece, the one who can't seem to do anything right. Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Clay McKenna, and I've seen plenty worse than a runaway pig, Miss Calloway." Behind them, Jeremiah was now investigating the water trough outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, apparently having worked up quite a thirst during his adventure. The festival bunting floated around him like a colourful cloud, and his snout was still covered with pie filling. "Any suggestions for catching him?" "Marshal, food usually works." "And patience." He bent to retrieve his hat, brushing off the dust with careful movements. "Why don't we start with some of those apples from Henderson's store? I suspect our friend there has developed a taste for them." For the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, Birdie felt like someone was on her side. This quiet marshal with the storm-cloud eyes and gentle hands seemed to understand that sometimes good intentions led to chaos, and that didn't necessarily make a person hopeless. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just help with the pig. "Welcome to Willowbrook, Miss Calloway," he replied, and this time she was sure she saw him smile. 3 days had passed since the pig incident, and Clay McKenna found himself taking longer routes through town that happened to lead past the church. He told himself it was good police work, keeping an eye on potential trouble spots. The fact that those trouble spots seemed to center around a certain preacher's niece was purely coincidental. This morning, however, the trouble was impossible to ignore. The church bell was ringing in a pattern that suggested either divine inspiration or complete chaos, and given what he'd learned about Miss Birdie Calloway, Clay suspected the latter. As he rounded the corner of Main Street, the source of the commotion became clear. A length of thick rope hung from the church bell tower, and about 10 feet off the ground, tangled in its coils like a fish in a net, was Birdie. Her blue dress had twisted around the rope, her hair had come completely loose from its pins, and she was trying with admirable determination to untangle herself without falling. A small crowd had gathered to watch the spectacle, including Mrs. Hutchins, who was providing running commentary on the proper behavior of young ladies, and Deputy Walsh, who was scratching his head and looking uncertain about whether this qualified as a law enforcement matter. "Miss Calloway," Clay called, approaching the base of the bell tower. "Seems like you've got yourself into a predicament. Marshal McKenna." Her voice carried a note of embarrassment mixed with relief. "I was trying to ring the bell for evening service practice, but the rope got wrapped around my skirt, and when I pulled, it just made everything worse." "How exactly did you manage to get 10 feet off the ground?" "Well, that's the complicated part." Even from his position below, Clay could see the flush creeping up her neck. "I was trying to untangle my skirt from the rope when the bell started pulling me up. I thought if I could just work myself free." A particularly enthusiastic tug on her part set the bell ringing again, drowning out the rest of her explanation and causing several members of the gathered crowd to wince at the cacophony. "Hold still," Clay called up to her. "I'm coming up." "Oh, you don't need to." But Clay was already examining the rope system. The church bell operated on a simple pulley mechanism, but Birdie's struggles had created a complex tangle that would require careful work to unravel safely. He began to climb, using the rope and wooden framework to pull himself up toward where she hung, suspended. "This is terribly embarrassing," Birdie said as he drew closer. "I seem to specialize in creating spectacles." "Everyone needs a specialty," Clay replied, surprised to find himself almost smiling. Up close, he could see that her green eyes were bright with unshed tears of frustration, and her hair fell around her shoulders in auburn waves that caught the afternoon light. "You're being very kind about this, but I know what people are saying, the preacher's niece who can't do anything right." Clay worked carefully at the knots, his hands brushing against the fabric of her dress as he tried to free her without compromising her modesty. "What I see," he said quietly, "is someone who was trying to help with church service and got tangled up in the process. Nothing shameful about that." "You really think so?" "I think," Clay said, finally loosening the main knot that had her trapped, "that intention matters more than outcome, and your intentions seem to run toward helping people." As the rope gave way, Birdie started to slip. Clay's arm came around her waist, steadying her against him as they worked their way down the rope together. For a moment, suspended there between earth and sky, they were closer than propriety strictly allowed. Clay found himself acutely aware of her warmth, the scent of lavender in her hair, and the way she fit perfectly against his side. "Thank you," she whispered, and something in her voice made him look down into her face. What he saw there, gratitude, vulnerability, and a spark of something deeper, hit him with unexpected force. They reached the ground to scattered applause from the onlookers, most of whom seemed more entertained than concerned. Mrs. Hutchins, however, was shaking her head in disapproval. "Miss Calloway, really," the older woman huffed. "A proper young lady doesn't find herself in such situations." "Mrs. Hutchins," Clay said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made people listen when he spoke. "Miss Calloway was attempting to provide a service to the church. I'd say that shows admirable community spirit." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. "You didn't have to defend me," Birdie said softly, smoothing down her skirts and trying to restore some order to her appearance. "Yes, I did." The certainty in his own voice surprised him. "This town can be quick to judge, but it's also capable of great kindness when people take the time to look past surface appearances." Deputy Walsh approached, looking relieved that the situation had resolved itself without requiring official intervention. "Everything all right here, Marshal?" "Just fine, Tom. Why don't you head back to the office? I'll finish up here." After the deputy left, Clay found himself reluctant to walk away. "The bell rope should be checked regularly," he said, though they both knew it was an excuse to linger. "Frayed ropes can be dangerous. I'll mention it to Uncle Ezekiel." Birdie was attempting to braid her long hair, but without a mirror, the task was proving challenging. "Here, let me." The words were out before Clay could think better of them. He'd watched Mrs. Chen braid her hair countless times, and his hands seemed to remember the pattern. Birdie went very still as his fingers worked through the silky strands, gathering them into a neat plait. It was an intimate gesture, more personal than anything he'd done with a woman in years, and yet it felt natural, as if he'd been doing it all his life. "There," he said, stepping back when the braid was secure. "That should hold. Thank you." Her hand went to the braid, and she smiled with such genuine warmth that Clay felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he hadn't even realized was there. "Miss Calloway, I was wondering." He stopped himself, suddenly uncertain. What was he doing? What was he about to ask her? "Yes? The Harvest Festival is next week. The committee could probably use help with the setup if you're interested." Her face lit up. "I'd love to help. I was hoping there might be something I could contribute. I'm sure there will be." Clay touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Miss Calloway. Good day, Marshal McKenna. And thank you for everything." As Clay walked back toward the main part of town, he could hear the church bell ringing again, this time in its proper rhythm for evening service. The sound followed him all the way to his office, where he sat at his desk, staring at reports he couldn't quite focus on. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Marshal Clay McKenna found himself looking forward to tomorrow, wondering what new adventure Miss Birdie Calloway might stumble into and whether he might be fortunate enough to help her out of it. The Harvest Festival was Willowbrook's most important social event of the year, a celebration that brought together families from homesteads scattered across the territory. This year, Birdie had thrown herself into the preparations with characteristic enthusiasm, determined to prove she could contribute something meaningful to her new community. She sat in the church basement, carefully stitching her square for the community quilt that would be auctioned to raise money for the new schoolhouse. Around her, the other ladies of the quilting circle worked in comfortable companionship, their needles flashing in the lamplight as they shared news and gentle gossip. Birdie's hand-sewn quilt square was meant to depict a simple prairie scene, wildflowers under a blue sky, with a small farmhouse in the corner. She'd worked on it for hours each evening, determined to create something beautiful that would reflect well on Uncle Ezekiel and her place in the community. "Oh my," said Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, peering over Birdie's shoulder. "That's quite lovely, dear." "It's supposed to be wildflowers," Birdie explained, holding up her work. "I thought it would represent the beauty of our territory." What she had actually created, through some combination of ambitious design and inexperienced stitching, was a quilt square that looked remarkably like a field of tiny dancing people rather than flowers. The blue sky had somehow become more purple than intended, and her farmhouse looked suspiciously like a ship sailing through the prairie. "It's very creative," Mrs. Henderson said diplomatically. "Quite unique. It's terrible, isn't it?" Birdie sighed, examining her work with fresh eyes. I wanted so much to contribute something worthwhile. Nonsense, said a warm voice from the doorway. It's perfect exactly as it is. Birdie looked up to see Clay McKenna ducking through the low doorframe of the basement, his hat in his hands and a gentle smile on his face. The other ladies immediately began fluttering around him, pleased to have such distinguished company at their gathering. Marshal McKenna, Mrs. Patterson simpered. How lovely to see you. Are you here about security for the festival? Partly, Clay replied, though his eyes were fixed on Birdie. I wanted to make sure everything was progressing smoothly, and I brought some extra lanterns from my father's store supplies, thought they might be useful for the evening activities. How thoughtful, Mrs. Henderson beamed. Isn't that thoughtful, ladies? A chorus of agreement filled the basement, but Clay seemed oblivious to the attention. He approached Birdie's workstation and examined her quilt square with serious consideration. This is remarkable, he said, and his tone suggested he genuinely meant it. It tells a story. Look here, these aren't just flowers. They're people celebrating, dancing in the prairie. And this isn't just a house, it's adventure, movement, the spirit of going somewhere new. Birdie stared at him in amazement. You really see all that? Art isn't about perfection, Miss Calloway. It's about capturing something true. Clay's fingers traced the air just above her stitching. This captures joy. That's worth more than technical precision. The other ladies murmured their agreement, though Birdie suspected they were mostly responding to Clay's obvious approval rather than any sudden appreciation for folk art. Still, his words warmed something inside her that had been cold since arriving in Willowbrook. I was hoping you might help with the festival setup tomorrow, Clay continued. We could use someone with your eye for creative solutions. I'd be honored to help. Excellent. We'll be starting at dawn to get the booths arranged before the heat gets too bad. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Birdie arrived at the town square before most of the other volunteers, eager to prove herself useful. Clay was already there, directing the placement of tables and booths with the quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize everything he did. Morning, Miss Calloway, he called, looking genuinely pleased to see her. Ready for a day of organized chaos? I specialize in chaos, she replied, though the organized part might be challenging. Their easy banter was interrupted by the arrival of other volunteers, including several unmarried young women who seemed to have developed sudden interests in festival preparation. Birdie noticed how they clustered around Clay, offering to help with tasks that clearly didn't require assistance. Marshal McKenna, called Miss Sarah Whitmore, the doctor's daughter, could you help me decide where the ladies' auxiliary booth should go? I simply can't make up my mind. Clay glanced toward Birdie with what looked like a plea for rescue. Miss Calloway has an excellent eye for layout, he said diplomatically. Perhaps she could advise on booth placement while I work on the platform for the band. For the next several hours, Birdie found herself serving as Clay's unofficial assistant, helping solve the various small crises that arose during festival preparation. When the lemonade stand collapsed, she suggested using barrels as temporary supports. When the bunting for the dance platform tangled in the wind, she climbed up to straighten it while Clay held the ladder steady. You're a natural at this, Clay said, as they took a brief rest in the shade of the church steps. Organization suits you. It's easier when people trust your judgment, Birdie replied. Back home, back east, I tried to help with charity events, but I always felt like people were just being polite. And now? Now I feel like maybe I can actually contribute something worthwhile. She gestured toward the bustling town square, where their combined efforts had created an appealing arrangement of booths and activities. Thank you for believing I could help. Clay was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Birdie, he said, and the sound of her name on his lips sent warmth spreading through her chest. I think you underestimate the effect you have on people. Before she could ask what he meant, they were interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the dance platform. The banner welcoming visitors to the Harvest Festival had somehow become entangled with the wind vane on top of Henderson's store, creating a colourful flag that was both beautiful and completely impractical. "How on earth?" Clay began. "The wind caught it when Tommy Watson was hanging it up," explained Deputy Walsh, jogging up to them. "He's still up there trying to get it down, but it's pretty well stuck." Birdie looked up at the tangled banner, then at the frustrated boy on the roof, then at Clay's resigned expression. "I might have an idea," she said. "Do you trust me?" Clay met her eyes, and she saw the exact moment when he made his decision. "Completely. Then let's go solve this together." As they walked toward the latest festival crisis, Birdie felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Philadelphia, the sense of being exactly where she belonged, working alongside someone who saw her potential rather than her problems. It was a feeling worth holding on to. Clay McKenna stood before the twin headstones in the small cemetery behind the church, his hat in his hands and his father's words echoing in his memory. "Every man needs something worth protecting, son. When you find that something, you'll understand what it means to truly live." The autumn wind rustled through the cottonwoods overhead, scattering leaves like memories across the graves of Rebecca McKenna and the baby daughter who had never drawn breath. 5 years had passed since that terrible night when Clay had lost everything he thought mattered, and he'd been walking through his days like a ghost ever since. "I found something, Rebecca," he whispered to the weathered granite. "Someone, actually, and I don't know what to do about it." The cemetery was peaceful in the late afternoon light, a place where he'd always been able to think clearly. But today, thoughts of green eyes and auburn hair kept intruding on his usual solitude. Birdie Calloway had somehow managed to slip past every defense he'd built around his heart, and the realization both thrilled and terrified him. He pulled the small velvet box from his vest pocket, the box he'd carried every day for 5 years without being able to open it. Inside lay Rebecca's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother before her. He'd planned to bury it with his wife, but something had stopped him at the last moment, some stubborn part of his heart that wasn't ready to let go completely. "Clay." He turned to find Birdie approaching through the cemetery gates, her expression soft with concern. She moved carefully between the headstones, her blue dress ghostly pale in the fading light. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was walking back from the Henderson place and saw you here. I can leave." "No." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "Please stay." She approached slowly, reading the names on the headstones with growing understanding. "Your wife? Rebecca. And our daughter, Grace. They died 5 years ago." The words came easier than he'd expected. "Complications during childbirth. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done. But you blame yourself anyway." Birdie's voice held no judgment, only gentle understanding. "I should have gotten the doctor sooner. Should have insisted she stay in town instead of trying to have the baby at the ranch. Should have been able to control things that were never yours to control." Birdie knelt beside Rebecca's grave, her fingers tracing the carved letters with reverent care. "I understand that kind of guilt, Clay. The weight of wondering if you could have changed everything with different choices." Clay studied her profile in the dying light. "What happened to you, Birdie? What brought you all the way out here?" For a long moment, she was silent. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "His name was Theodore Ashworth. We were engaged to be married, a very suitable match, according to everyone who mattered. He was wealthy, charming, connected to all the right families. But he was also cruel in small ways that no one else saw. The way he criticized my opinions, dismissed my thoughts, made me feel foolish for caring about things he considered unimportant." Birdie's hand went to her mother's cameo brooch, seeking comfort from the familiar weight of it. "I told myself it would get better after we married, that he was just nervous about the wedding." Clay felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same protective rage that had made him pin on a badge in the first place. "What changed your mind?" "I found out he was stealing from my inheritance. My father had left me a substantial trust fund, and Theodore had convinced my guardians to let him manage it as my future husband. He was using the money to cover his gambling debts, while planning to have me declared mentally incompetent after our marriage. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. So you ran, 3 days before our wedding, with nothing but the clothes on my back and my mother's jewelry. I couldn't prove what he'd done, and who would have believed me against his word? Birdie's voice carried years of pain. A hysterical woman making accusations against a respected businessman? I would have ended up in an asylum. Clay knelt beside her, his hand covering hers where it rested on the headstone. You were brave to leave. I was terrified to stay. She turned to look at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. I've been running ever since, trying to convince myself that starting over means the past can't follow you. But sometimes I wonder if I'm just fooling myself. The past shapes us, Clay said carefully, but it doesn't have to define us. You're not the same woman who fled Philadelphia, Birdie. You're stronger now. I can see it in the way you stand up to Mrs. Hutchins, the way you refuse to let setbacks discourage you from helping people. And you're not the same man who lost his family 5 years ago. You still carry the grief that's love, and it's beautiful. But you're not dead inside anymore, Clay. I can see it in your eyes. Their faces were closer now, close enough that Clay could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, close enough to count the freckles across her nose. The air between them seemed charged with possibility and unspoken longing. Birdie, he whispered, and her name sounded like a prayer on his lips. Yes? I haven't felt this way since. He stopped, struggling for words that could encompass the magnitude of what she'd awakened in him. Since you remembered what it feels like to hope. Since I remembered what it feels like to be alive. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, full of wonder, and the careful tenderness of two wounded hearts learning to trust again. When they broke apart, Clay rested his forehead against hers, marveling at the rightness of holding her in his arms. What happens now? Birdie asked softly. Clay looked down at the velvet box in his hand, then made a decision that felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. He opened the box and carefully removed Rebecca's ring, placing it gently on her headstone. Now, he said, taking Birdie's hand in both of his, we figure out how to build something new without forgetting what we've learned from what came before. As they walked back toward town together, neither of them noticed the stranger watching from the shadows near the cemetery fence, or the way he turned toward the telegraph office with purposeful strides. Some secrets, once shared, create bonds strong enough to weather any storm, but other secrets travel faster than hope, and sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how far you run. Uncle Ezekiel was pacing the parsonage kitchen when Birdie returned from her evening walk, his weathered face creased with worry. In his trembling hands, he held a yellow telegram that seemed to carry the weight of all her fears. "Child," he said without preamble, "we need to talk." Birdie's heart sank as she recognized the look of a man carrying bad news. "What is it?" "Uncle, this came for me an hour ago." He handed her the telegram, his eyes filled with protective concern. "I think you'd better read it yourself." The words swam before her eyes as she scanned the brief message. "Stop. Theodore Ashworth seeking information about niece Bridget Calloway." "Stop. Hired men asking questions in Denver." "Stop. Suggests legal action pending." "Stop. Be careful." "Stop. Reverend Matthews, Philadelphia." "How did he find me?" Birdie whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. "I was so careful. I used my middle name when I bought the train ticket, paid cash for everything. Men with money and determination can find almost anyone, given time." Uncle Ezekiel sat across from her, his pastoral training evident in his calm demeanor despite his obvious concern. "The question now is what we're going to do about it." "We?" Birdie looked up at him in surprise. "Uncle Ezekiel, I won't drag you into this. If Theodore is really coming after me, Then he'll have to go through an old preacher who's been dealing with bullies a lot longer than that boy's been alive. The steel in her uncle's voice reminded her that he'd ministered to some rough, frontier communities before settling in Willowbrook. Your family, Birdie. Family stands together. Before she could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Uncle Ezekiel and Birdie exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. It was far too late for social calls. Reverend Calloway? The voice from the front porch was unfamiliar, with an Eastern accent that made Birdie's blood run cold. We'd like a word with you about your niece. Birdie rose from her chair, but Uncle Ezekiel motioned for her to stay put. Let me handle this, he whispered, then called toward the door. It's rather late for visitors, gentlemen. Perhaps you could come back in the morning. I'm afraid our business can't wait, Reverend. We represent certain interested parties who are concerned about Miss Calloway's welfare. The euphemistic language didn't fool anyone. Birdie recognized the tone polite on the surface, but carrying an unmistakable threat underneath. These were the kind of men Theodore would hire, professionals who knew how to apply pressure without technically breaking the law. Birdie, Uncle Ezekiel said quietly, is there somewhere you can go? Someone who might? Clay, she breathed, understanding immediately. I need to get to Clay. The back door leads to the alley behind the church. If you can make it to the marshal's office. Another knock, more insistent this time. Reverend Calloway, we know Miss Calloway is inside. We have legal documents requiring her return to Philadelphia for evaluation of her mental competency. This can be handled quietly and with dignity, or it can become unpleasant for everyone involved. Birdie felt the familiar panic rising in her throat, the same choking fear she'd experienced the night she fled Philadelphia. But this time, something was different. This time, she had people who cared about her, people who would stand by her side. Go, Uncle Ezekiel whispered urgently. I'll delay them as long as possible. Birdie grabbed her shawl and moved toward the back door, then stopped. In her mother's sewing basket sat the cameo brooch she'd left there while helping with supper preparations. The family heirloom that represented everything she'd lost and everything she hoped to rebuild. She snatched up the brooch, pinning it to her dress as she slipped out into the night. The alley behind the church was dark and narrow, filled with shadows that could hide a dozen watchers. Every footstep seemed to echo like gunshots in the still air. The marshal's office was only 3 blocks away, but it felt like miles as Birdie made her way through the darkened streets of Willowbrook. Behind her, she could hear voices from the parsonage, Uncle Ezekiel's calm tones countered by increasingly aggressive demands from the men at his door. She was halfway to safety when a figure stepped out of the shadows ahead of her, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of calculated charm she remembered all too well. "Hello, Bridget," Theodore Ashworth said, his smile as cold as winter moonlight. "You've led us quite a chase." Birdie's hand went instinctively to her throat, where her mother's brooch rested. "Theodore, I should have known you'd come yourself eventually. Did you really think you could disappear forever? That kind of thinking is exactly why the court needs to evaluate your competency." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne and barely controlled anger. "You've embarrassed me, Bridget, embarrassed my family. That has consequences. I'm not going back with you. I'm afraid you don't have a choice. I have legal documents, signed by a judge, declaring you a danger to yourself and others. Your little adventure in running away only proves my point about your unstable mental state. Those documents are fraudulent, and you know it." Theodore's laugh was as sharp as broken glass. "Prove it." A respected businessman's word against that of a hysterical woman who abandoned her fiancé 3 days before their wedding? Who do you think a territorial court will believe? The sound of running footsteps echoed from the direction of the church. Theodore's expression shifted from confident to concerned as the steps grew closer. "Birdie!" Clay's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "Birdie, where are you?" "Here!" she called, never taking her eyes off Theodore. "I'm here." Clay rounded the corner at a dead run, his hand on his gun and his face set in lines of deadly purpose. When he saw Theodore standing too close to Birdie, his grey eyes went cold as winter steel. "Step away from her," Clay said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made smart men reconsider their choices. Theodore straightened his coat and smiled his most practiced smile. "Marshal McKenna, I presume. Theodore Ashworth, from Philadelphia. I'm here on official business regarding my fiancée." "Former fiancée," Birdie corrected firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere with you, Theodore. Miss Calloway is under the protection of this town," Clay said, moving to stand beside Birdie. "If you have legal business here, you can present it during regular office hours." "How quaint," Theodore replied. "A frontier marshal playing knight-errant. I hope you understand what you're getting yourself into, Marshal. This woman is not what she seems." Clay's hand moved closer to his gun. "I understand plenty, Mr. Ashworth. The question is whether you understand that in this territory, a man's character matters more than his bank account." The tension stretched between the three of them like a bowstring, full of promise and threat. In the distance, more voices could be heard. Uncle Ezekiel calling for help, Deputy Walsh responding to the commotion. Theodore's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "This isn't over, Bridget. You can hide behind your frontier protectors for now, but the law will catch up with you eventually. When it does, I'll be waiting." He tipped his hat mockingly and melted back into the shadows, leaving Birdie and Clay alone in the moonlight with the certain knowledge that the fight for her freedom had only just begun. The marshal's office felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, filled with shadows and the weight of decisions that could change everything. Birdie sat in the chair beside Clay's desk, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, while Uncle Ezekiel paced near the window and Deputy Walsh stood guard by the door. "Tell me everything," Clay said quietly, his storm-grey eyes fixed on Birdie with gentle intensity. "If we're going to fight this, I need to understand exactly what we're up against." Birdie's fingers found her mother's cameo brooch, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "It's worse than I told you before, Clay. Much worse." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small, worn Bible, the same one that had belonged to her mother, with its faded leather cover and pages softened by years of use. "Everything I need to prove Theodore's crimes is hidden in here." Clay raised an eyebrow. "In your mother's Bible? My father was a lawyer before his gambling debts destroyed him," Birdie explained, carefully opening the book to reveal several folded documents tucked between the pages of Psalms. "He taught me that the most important papers should be hidden in the last place anyone would think to look." A frontier preacher's niece carrying her mother's Bible? Nobody would suspect. Uncle Ezekiel stopped pacing and approached the desk. "Bank records showing Theodore's embezzlement from my trust fund. Correspondence between him and Judge Harrison about having me declared incompetent. Medical records from a doctor who refused to falsify reports about my mental state." Birdie's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the fear giving way to righteous anger. "And most importantly, a sworn affidavit from Theodore's former business partner about their scheme to defraud several wealthy widows and heiresses." Clay examined the papers with the careful attention to detail that made him an excellent lawman. "This is substantial evidence, Birdie. Why didn't you use it back in Philadelphia?" "Because Judge Harrison was Theodore's business partner in several ventures. The whole system was corrupt, and I was just one woman against a network of powerful men." Birdie's hand trembled slightly as she traced the edges of her mother's Bible. "But these documents prove it wasn't just about my inheritance. Theodore and Judge Harrison were running a systematic operation targeting women with substantial inheritances, arranging fraudulent marriages or competency hearings, then stealing their assets." "Sweet Lord," Uncle Ezekiel breathed. "How many other women?" "At least 6 that I know of," Birdie said grimly. 3 are currently confined in private asylums, declared incompetent by Judge Harrison. 2 others died under mysterious circumstances after signing over their inheritances. I was supposed to be the 7th. Deputy Walsh whistled low. That's not embezzlement, Marshal. That's organized criminal conspiracy. Clay's jaw tightened as he read through the affidavit. According to this, Theodore's partner was willing to testify against him in exchange for immunity. What happened to him? He died in a carriage accident 2 days after signing that statement. Very convenient timing. Birdie's voice carried a bitterness that spoke of hard-won wisdom. That's when I knew I had to run. I was the only witness left who could connect Theodore to the whole scheme. The men who came tonight, Clay said thoughtfully, they're not just hired detectives, they're part of the operation. Theodore calls them recovery specialists, Birdie confirmed. They specialize in retrieving inconvenient witnesses and returning them to places where their testimony can be discouraged. Uncle Ezekiel sat down heavily in the chair beside his niece. Birdie, why didn't you tell us this from the beginning? Because I was afraid, she admitted. In Philadelphia, when I tried to expose what Theodore was doing, I was dismissed as a hysterical woman making wild accusations. Who would believe such an incredible story? I believe it, Clay said firmly, and more importantly, I believe you. He gathered the documents carefully, his mind already working through the legal implications. The question now is how to get these to someone in authority who isn't part of Theodore's network. That's the real problem, Birdie said. Theodore has connections throughout the Eastern legal establishment. Even if we could get word to honest authorities, how long would it take? And would I survive long enough to testify? A soft knock at the office door interrupted their conversation. Deputy Walsh drew his gun, while Clay motioned for everyone to stay quiet. Marshal McKenna. The voice belonged to Mrs. Henderson, and she sounded agitated. Are you in there? I need to speak with you urgently. Clay nodded to Walsh, who unlocked the door. Mrs. Henderson bustled in, her grey hair escaping from its nighttime cap and her shawl thrown hastily over her nightgown. Mrs. Henderson, Clay said, it's not safe for you to be out. That's exactly why I'm here, she interrupted. Those men who came asking about Birdie, they're not what they claim to be. I've been running a store in frontier towns for 30 years, Marshal, and I know trouble when I see it. What did you observe? Clay asked, his attention sharpening. They were asking too many specific questions about Birdie's daily routines, where she goes, who she talks to. That's not the behavior of men conducting a legal inquiry. That's the behavior of men planning something unpleasant. Mrs. Henderson's usually warm demeanor had been replaced by steely determination. And there's something else. I saw one of them talking to Judge Harrison through the telegraph office window. They know each other. Birdie went pale. Judge Harrison is here? In Willowbrook? Arrived on the evening train with official-looking papers and a very smug attitude, Mrs. Henderson confirmed. He's staying at the hotel and making noises about holding a competency hearing first thing in the morning. Clay felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. They're moving fast because they know we might have evidence against them. If they can get Birdie declared incompetent by a corrupted judge before anyone can examine the case properly, then everything I've discovered becomes the ravings of a madwoman, Birdie finished. Theodore wins, and all those other women remain trapped or dead. Not if I have anything to say about it, Clay said, rising from his desk with grim purpose. Mrs. Henderson, thank you for the warning. Can you spread word quietly to people we trust? We're going to need witnesses. What kind of witnesses? Uncle Ezekiel asked. The kind who can testify to Birdie's character and mental competency. If they want to play legal games, we'll play them right back. Clay turned to his deputy. Tom, I need you to ride to the territorial capital. Find Judge Morrison. He's an honest man who owes me a favor. Bring him back here as fast as you can. What about Theodore and his men? Birdie asked. They won't just sit quietly while we build our case. Clay's hand moved to his gun, and something dangerous flickered in his grey eyes. "Let them try something. This is my territory, and I know every inch of it. If Theodore Ashworth wants to play rough, he'll discover that frontier justice has its own rules." "Clay," Birdie said softly, "I need you to understand something. If you stand up to Theodore publicly, you'll become a target too. He's not just vindictive, he's dangerous. People who oppose him tend to suffer unfortunate accidents." "Then it's a good thing I'm hard to kill," Clay replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, someone needs to stand up to men like Theodore. If not here, if not now, then when?" As the first light of dawn began to creep through the office windows, the small group made their plans with the careful precision of people who understood that failure meant more than just disappointment. It meant the difference between justice and a lifetime of running. Outside, Willowbrook was waking up to what promised to be the most important day in the town's history. Before the sun set again, everyone would know whether courage and truth could triumph over corruption and power, or whether some fights were too big for even the bravest hearts to win. By 8 o'clock in the morning, word had spread through Willowbrook like wildfire, and the town square was filled with an unusual tension. Clay McKenna stood on the steps of his office, his father's Colt .45 strapped to his hip, the same gun that had helped tame this territory 30 years ago. The weight of it felt different today, not just a tool of law enforcement, but a symbol of the legacy he'd inherited and the stand he was about to take. Deputy Walsh had ridden hard for the territorial capital before dawn, but Judge Morrison was still hours away at best. That meant Clay would have to buy time, using every legal maneuver and bit of frontier authority he possessed to prevent Theodore's kangaroo court from proceeding. "Marshal McKenna," Judge Harrison called from the hotel steps, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "I trust you've had time to consider our discussion. Miss Calloway's competency hearing will begin at 9 o'clock sharp." Clay studied the man who'd traveled all this way to destroy Birdie's life. Harrison was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 45, with the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal or worked with his hands. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as a man of means, but there was something predatory in his pale blue eyes that set Clay's teeth on edge. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Judge Harrison," Clay replied, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Miss Calloway has the right to legal representation, and her attorney isn't available until this afternoon." "Attorney?" Theodore Ashworth emerged from the hotel, flanked by two men who had the hard look of professional enforcers. "Since when does a mentally incompetent woman have the right to choose her own legal counsel?" "Since she hasn't been declared incompetent yet," Clay answered evenly, "and until she is, she retains all the rights of any citizen of this territory." A small crowd was gathering now, townspeople who'd heard rumors and came to see what the commotion was about. Clay spotted Mrs. Henderson near the general store, Uncle Ezekiel standing with several members of his congregation, and a handful of ranchers who'd come to town for supplies and stayed to watch the show. "This is highly irregular," Judge Harrison huffed. "I have the authority to conduct these proceedings immediately." "In the territory of Montana," Clay said, stepping down from his office steps to face the judge directly, "you have the authority that I allow you to have, and I'm not convinced your paperwork is in order." It was a calculated gamble, challenging Harrison's credentials in public where witnesses could hear every word. Clay saw the flash of anger in the judge's eyes and knew he'd hit a nerve. "My credentials are beyond reproach, Marshal. I suggest you don't interfere with the lawful execution of my duties. And I suggest you remember that this is my jurisdiction," Clay replied. "Any legal proceedings conducted in Willowbrook fall under my oversight. I'll need to examine all your documentation before any hearing can proceed." Theodore stepped forward, his face flushed with barely controlled rage. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously." "I can and I am." Clay's hand moved casually to rest on his gun butt, a gesture that wasn't lost on Theodore's hired men. "Mr. Ashworth, you and your associates are guests in this town. I'd advise you to remember that." "Is that a threat, Marshal?" "It's a promise. You're free to conduct your business according to the law, but any attempt to circumvent proper procedures will be met with appropriate response." The crowd was growing larger now, and Clay could see that word was spreading to the outer edges of town. Good. The more witnesses there were to this confrontation, the harder it would be for Theodore and Harrison to simply make problems disappear. Birdie appeared in the doorway of the marshal's office, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear Clay could see in her green eyes. She'd pinned her mother's cameo brooch prominently at her throat, and somehow that small act of courage made Clay's chest swell with pride. "Bridget," Theodore called, his voice taking on the honeyed tone Clay remembered from their first meeting. "Darling, this has gone on long enough. You're not well, and you need help. Come with me now, and we can get you the treatment you need." "I'm perfectly well, Theodore," Birdie replied, her voice steady and clear for all to hear. "What I don't need is to be dragged back to Philadelphia to face fraudulent charges from corrupt officials." A murmur ran through the crowd at her words. These were frontier people who'd learned to be suspicious of Eastern authority and sympathetic to anyone fighting against unfair odds. "You see," Judge Harrison said, gesturing toward Birdie with theatrical concern. "Classic paranoid delusions. She imagines vast conspiracies where none exist." "Do I?" Birdie stepped forward, pulling a folded document from her reticule. "Then perhaps you can explain this bank record showing how Theodore Ashworth embezzled $4,000 from my trust fund to cover his gambling debts?" Harrison's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. "Forged documents are hardly proof of anything except the depths of your delusion. What about this correspondence between you and Theodore discussing the best methods for having me declared incompetent?" Birdie produced another paper. "Or this medical report from Dr. Whitman stating that I showed no signs of mental instability when Theodore tried to have me committed?" The crowd was listening intently now, and Clay could see the tide of public opinion beginning to shift. These people might not understand Eastern legal complexities, but they recognized courage when they saw it, and they respected someone willing to fight for herself. "Enough of this charade," one of Theodore's hired men growled, stepping toward Birdie. "We have our orders." "And I have mine," Clay said quietly, moving to intercept the man. "Touch her, and you'll find out how seriously we take assault charges in this territory." The enforcer stopped, his hand hovering near his gun. For a tense moment, the square was silent except for the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. "There's no need for violence," Judge Harrison said hastily. "We're civilized men conducting civilized business." "Civilized men don't forge medical documents," Mrs. Henderson called from the edge of the crowd. "Civilized men don't steal from orphaned young women." "That's right," added Tom Murphy, the blacksmith. "Miss Calloway's been nothing but helpful since she arrived. Helped my wife when our youngest took sick, brought food to old Jake when he was laid up. That's not the behavior of someone who's not right in the head." More voices joined in, neighbors and friends who'd watched Birdie integrate herself into their community through kindness and genuine care for others. Clay felt a surge of satisfaction as he realized that Willowbrook was rallying around one of its own. "This is preposterous," Theodore sputtered. "You can't seriously expect a territorial court to accept the testimony of honest citizens," Clay interrupted, "of people who've actually spent time with Miss Calloway and can testify to her character and mental competency." "That's exactly what I expect." Uncle Ezekiel stepped forward from the crowd, his black coat and clerical collar giving him natural authority. "As Miss Calloway's guardian in this territory, I formally request a postponement of any proceedings until proper legal representation can be arranged." "Seconded," called Dr. Phillips, who'd been quietly examining the medical documents Birdie had produced. "These papers suggest serious irregularities in the original competency evaluation. I'd like time to conduct my own assessment." Judge Harrison looked around the square, clearly realizing that his carefully planned judicial ambush was turning into a public relations disaster. The crowd was no longer simply curious, they were actively hostile to his presence and increasingly protective of Birdie. "Very well," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll allow a postponement until this afternoon, but this hearing will proceed. Marshal McKenna, with or without your cooperation." "It'll proceed according to territorial law," Clay replied firmly, "or it won't proceed at all." As the crowd began to disperse, Clay caught Theodore's eye across the square. The man's expression had shifted from confident arrogance to something darker and more dangerous. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. "Clay," Birdie said quietly, appearing at his elbow, "thank you for standing up to them, but you need to know Theodore doesn't give up easily. When legal methods fail him, he turns to other approaches." "Let him try," Clay said, his hand still resting on his father's Colt. "This isn't Philadelphia, and I'm not some pampered Eastern gentleman who's never been in a real fight." "That's what I'm afraid of," Birdie whispered. "He's not going to challenge you to a duel, Clay. Men like Theodore fight dirty. They use poison instead of pistols, accidents instead of honest confrontation." Clay looked down into her worried green eyes and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. "Then, it's a good thing I learned to fight dirty long before I learned to fight fair." Theodore Ashworth picked the wrong marshal and the wrong town to mess with. As they stood together on the steps of the marshal's office, Clay McKenna made a silent promise to his father's memory, to the badge on his chest, and to the woman beside him. Justice would be served in Willowbrook, even if he had to face down every corrupt official and hired gun between here and Philadelphia to make it happen. The weight of his father's gun at his hip reminded him that some things were worth fighting for, and some fights couldn't be won with words alone. The church bell rang 6 times as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, and Judge Morrison finally arrived in Willowbrook on a hard-ridden horse, his territorial robes dusty from the urgent journey. Clay felt relief wash through him as he watched the honest judge dismount outside the marshal's office. Reinforcements had arrived just in time. "Morrison," Clay said, gripping the older man's hand firmly, "thank you for coming so quickly. Your deputy said it was urgent." Judge Morrison was a lean man in his 60s, weathered by years of frontier justice, but with eyes that still burned with integrity. Something about a corrupt Eastern judge trying to railroad an innocent woman. That's putting it mildly. Clay quickly explained the situation while they walked toward the town square, where a crowd was already gathering for what everyone knew would be the most important legal proceeding in Willowbrook's history. Theodore and Judge Harrison had spent the afternoon huddled in the hotel, no doubt refining their strategy and growing increasingly frustrated by the unexpected resistance. Their hired enforcers had been visible throughout the day, lounging around town with the casual menace of men accustomed to intimidating opposition. Now, as evening approached, both sides were ready for the confrontation that would determine Birdie's fate. The improvised courtroom had been set up in the town square, with borrowed tables and chairs arranged to accommodate the proceedings. Nearly the entire population of Willowbrook had turned out to witness the event, along with ranchers and homesteaders from miles around who'd heard about the drama unfolding in their county seat. "This is highly irregular," Judge Harrison complained as he saw Judge Morrison taking his place at the makeshift bench. "I was promised jurisdiction over these proceedings." "You have jurisdiction?" Judge Morrison replied calmly, settling his territorial robes around him. "And so do I. Since this case involves questions of territorial law and interstate fraud, I think it's appropriate for both courts to hear the evidence together." Clay caught Birdie's eye from across the square and nodded encouragingly. She sat beside Uncle Ezekiel, her mother's cameo brooch catching the late sunlight like a beacon of hope. Over the course of the day, she'd transformed from a frightened refugee into a woman prepared to fight for her freedom with everything she possessed. "Let's proceed," Judge Morrison announced. "Mr. Ashworth, you've petitioned for a competency hearing regarding Miss Bridget Calloway. Please present your evidence." Theodore rose, his expensive suit immaculate despite the day's tension. "Your Honor, Miss Calloway abandoned our engagement 3 days before our wedding, fled Philadelphia with stolen property, and has been living under an assumed name while making wild accusations against respected citizens. This clearly demonstrates severe mental instability, requiring immediate intervention." "And what evidence do you have to support these claims?" Morrison asked. "Judge Harrison has conducted a thorough review of her case and determined—" "I'd prefer to hear the evidence for myself," Morrison interrupted. "Judge Harrison's conclusions are noted, but this court will examine the facts independently." Harrison's face flushed red, but he couldn't object without revealing the corrupt nature of his previous ruling. "Miss Calloway," Judge Morrison continued, "you're entitled to respond to these charges and present your own evidence." Birdie stood gracefully, her voice clear and strong as it carried across the square. "Your Honor, I left Philadelphia because Mr. Ashworth was embezzling from my inheritance and conspiring with Judge Harrison to have me declared incompetent so they could steal my family's estate. I have documentary evidence of their crimes." A murmur ran through the crowd as she produced the papers from her mother's Bible, holding them up for all to see. "These are bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals from my trust fund, correspondence between Mr. Ashworth and Judge Harrison discussing their scheme, medical records proving I was never mentally incompetent, and most importantly, a sworn affidavit from Mr. Ashworth's former business partner detailing their conspiracy to defraud wealthy women throughout Pennsylvania." Theodore shot to his feet. "Those documents are forgeries." "This woman is clearly delusional." "Mr. Ashworth," Judge Morrison said sternly, "you'll have your chance to respond. Miss Calloway, may I examine these documents?" For the next hour, Judge Morrison carefully reviewed each piece of evidence while the crowd waited in tense silence. Harrison grew increasingly agitated as the territorial judge's expression shifted from neutral inquiry to grim understanding. "These appear to be authentic," Morrison finally announced. "The signatures match other documents I've seen from Philadelphia courts. The medical records bear official seals, and the handwriting in the correspondence is consistent throughout." "Impossible," Harrison sputtered. "I personally—" He caught himself too late. "You personally what, Judge Harrison?" Morrison asked quietly. "Were you about to say you personally participated in creating different documents?" The crowd leaned forward, sensing that the crucial moment had arrived. "I think," Morrison continued, "we need to hear from some character witnesses regarding Miss Calloway's current mental state. Dr. Phillips?" The local doctor stood and spoke clearly. "I've observed Miss Calloway extensively since her arrival in Willowbrook. She's intelligent, articulate, and shows no signs of mental instability. In my medical opinion, she's completely competent to manage her own affairs." One by one, the townspeople testified to Birdie's character, her kindness, her helpfulness, her obvious sanity, and good judgment. With each testimony, Theodore's case crumbled further, and Judge Harrison's credibility evaporated like morning mist. As the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Judge Morrison prepared to render his verdict on a case that would determine whether justice could triumph over corruption, even in the remote corners of the American frontier. Judge Morrison's gavel struck the makeshift bench with the authority of absolute justice, and the sound echoed across the town square like a bell tolling the end of an era of corruption. The territorial judge's weathered face was set in lines of granite as he prepared to deliver his verdict in what had become the most important legal proceeding in Willowbrook's history. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the square, "This court finds that Miss Bridget Calloway is completely mentally competent and capable of managing her own affairs." A cheer erupted from the gathered townspeople, but Morrison raised his hand for silence. He wasn't finished. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his tone growing more severe, The evidence presented reveals a conspiracy to defraud Miss Calloway of her rightful inheritance through the use of falsified medical documents and corrupted legal proceedings. Judge Harrison, your conduct in this matter is a disgrace to the judicial system. Harrison's face went white as parchment. Your Honor, I protest. Your protest is noted and overruled. You are hereby stripped of any authority to conduct legal proceedings in this territory, and I'm ordering a full investigation into your activities in Pennsylvania. Morrison's gavel struck again with finality. Mr. Ashworth, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and attempting to suborn justice. Theodore's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. You can't do this. I have connections. Influence people who will. People who will what? Clay McKenna stepped forward, his marshal's badge gleaming in the fading sunlight, and his father's Colt ready at his hip. Threaten a territorial judge? Intimidate witnesses? I think you'll find that your Eastern connections don't carry much weight out here. The two hired enforcers moved toward their weapons, but found themselves facing not just Clay, but a half-dozen armed ranchers who'd positioned themselves strategically around the square. These frontier men had no patience for Eastern corruption, and they were prepared to back their marshal's play. I wouldn't, Clay said quietly to the gunman. This isn't Philadelphia. Out here, justice has teeth, and the people aren't afraid to use them. The enforcers slowly raised their hands, recognizing that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by men who knew the territory and weren't intimidated by hired muscle. This is outrageous, Theodore sputtered as Clay produced iron shackles. I demand to speak with the territorial governor. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Clay said, clicking the shackles around Theodore's wrists with professional efficiency. I'd suggest you use it. Judge Morrison turned to address the crowd. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can bring corruption to our territory. The law here isn't for sale, and justice isn't a commodity to be bought by the highest bidder. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward from the crowd, her face bright with satisfaction. What about the other women Theodore mentioned? The ones still trapped in those asylums? This evidence will be forwarded to federal authorities, Morrison replied. Those cases will be reopened and investigated. If other victims of this conspiracy can be identified, they'll receive justice as well. Birdie rose from her chair, her mother's cameo brooch catching the last rays of sunlight like a symbol of hope fulfilled. For the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, she stood completely straight, no longer bowed by shame or fear. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying to every person in the square. All of you. You took in a stranger and gave her the chance to prove herself. You stood up to powerful men because you believed in the truth. I'll never forget what you've done for me. Uncle Ezekiel beamed with pride as he stood beside his niece. Willowbrook has always been a place where people are judged by their character, not their circumstances. You've proven yourself worthy of that tradition, child. Clay approached Birdie as the crowd began to disperse, most people heading toward the Silver Dollar Saloon to celebrate the victory of justice over corruption. The hired enforcers were being led to the jail by Deputy Walsh, while Theodore continued his protests from behind iron bars. It's over, Clay said softly, taking her hands in his. You're free, Birdie. Truly free. We're free, she corrected, looking up into his storm-grey eyes. Because none of this would have been possible without you. You believed in me when I barely believed in myself. I love you, Clay said, the words coming as naturally as breathing. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if you'll have me. Yes, Birdie whispered, rising on her toes to kiss him as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Yes to everything, Clay McKenna. Yes to love. Yes to hope. Yes to building a life together in this wonderful place. As they embraced in the town square, surrounded by people who'd become their family and protected by laws that valued truth over power, Both Clay and Birdie understood that they'd found something precious, not just love, but a place where they truly belonged. The territorial judge's gavel had done more than deliver justice. It had cleared the way for new beginnings, fresh starts, and the kind of happiness that comes from facing adversity together and emerging stronger on the other side. 6 months later, spring had painted Willowbrook in shades of hope and renewal. The mountain peaks still wore caps of snow, but wildflowers dotted the meadows surrounding the town, and the cottonwoods along Main Street rustled with new leaves that caught the morning sunlight like scattered gold coins. Birdie McKenna stood before the mirror in what had once been her uncle's spare bedroom, but was now the bride's preparation room for the most anticipated wedding in Willowbrook's history. Her reflection showed a woman transformed not just by love, but by the confidence that came from knowing she belonged somewhere, truly and completely. The wedding dress had been a community effort, with every woman in town contributing something to its creation. Mrs. Henderson had provided the ivory silk, Mrs. Patterson had donated the delicate lace trim, and the quilting circle had worked together to create intricate embroidery that told the story of Birdie's journey to happiness. At her throat, her mother's cameo brooch gleamed with quiet dignity, no longer a memento of loss, but a symbol of continuity and hope. "You look beautiful, child," Uncle Ezekiel said from the doorway, his eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become. Thank you, Uncle, for everything. For taking me in, for believing in me, for standing up to those men when it mattered most." Birdie turned from the mirror to embrace the man who'd become more father than guardian to her. "You saved yourself, Birdie. You had the courage to run, the strength to fight, and the wisdom to trust good people when you found them. That's all your own doing." Through the window, they could hear the sounds of celebration beginning to build in the town square. The entire territory seemed to have turned out for the wedding of Marshal Clay McKenna and the woman who'd captured not just his heart, but the affection of everyone who knew her. "Are you ready?" Uncle Ezekiel asked, offering her his arm. "More than ready," Birdie replied, meaning every word. The short walk to the church felt like a journey through a dream. Everywhere she looked, Birdie saw faces of people who'd become family. Mrs. Henderson beaming from the steps of her store, Dr. Phillips nodding approvingly as she passed, the Murphy children waving excitedly from their perch on a wagon. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a celebration of community, of justice triumphant, of love conquering fear. Clay waited for her at the altar, resplendent in his best suit, with his marshal's badge polished to mirror brightness. But it was his eyes that took her breath away, storm-grey depths filled with such love and wonder that she felt tears prick her own eyes in response. "Dearly beloved," Uncle Ezekiel began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other not just love, but the courage to build something beautiful from the ashes of their past trials." The ceremony was simple but profound, filled with the kind of honest emotion that needed no elaborate ornamentation. When Clay slipped the ring onto Birdie's finger, a band crafted by Tom Murphy, the town blacksmith, from gold that Clay himself had panned from the creek that ran through his property, she felt the last of her old fears melt away like snow in spring sunshine. "You may kiss your bride," Uncle Ezekiel announced, and Clay did so with a tenderness that made every woman in the church sigh with romantic satisfaction. The reception that followed was held in the town square, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by every family in the territory. Mrs. Henderson's famous apple pie held place of honor, alongside roasted beef from Clay's ranch, fresh bread from the baker, and enough whiskey to ensure that the celebration would be remembered for years to come. "Speech," called Tom Murphy, raising his glass high. "Let's hear from the Marshal." Clay rose from his place at the head table, his arm around Birdie's waist as he addressed the crowd. "6 months ago, I thought I knew what my life would be. I was wrong, and I've never been happier about being wrong in my life. Laughter rippled through the crowd, along with murmurs of agreement from men who remembered what it felt like to be surprised by love. Birdie didn't just come into my life, Clay continued, his voice growing more serious. She reminded me that courage isn't about being unafraid, it's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. She showed this whole town what it means to stand up for truth, even when powerful people try to silence you. He turned to look down at his new wife, his expression tender. And she taught me that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected collisions. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, raising their glasses to toast the couple who'd become symbols of hope and resilience for everyone who'd witnessed their journey. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued under the stars, Clay and Birdie found a quiet moment together on the church steps, watching their friends and neighbors dance in the lantern-lit square. "Any regrets?" Clay asked softly, his fingers intertwined with hers. "Just one," Birdie replied, leaning against his shoulder. "I regret that it took me so long to find my way to you. You found me exactly when you were supposed to," Clay said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And now we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." In the distance, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the mountain peaks, painting them in soft shades of rose and gold. It was the beginning of a new day, a new life, and a new chapter in the story of Willowbrook, a place where justice prevailed, love conquered fear. And sometimes the most beautiful things began with an unexpected collision on a dusty street. The ring on Birdie's finger caught the early morning light, a circle of gold that represented not an ending, but a beginning, the promise of years filled with laughter, purpose, and the deep contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong, with exactly the right person, at exactly the right time.